there were other factors that contributed to the economic boom in the 1920s. One of them was the growing availability of credit and installment buying. We're not yet to the point of people having credit cards. That was an invention of the 1950s. But the idea is the same, that credit allows you to purchase items that you might not have the cash on hand. If you think about our purchasing habits today, and probably at least some of you have credit cards already, certainly people in your family have credit cards. What kind of things do we buy with credit cards now? Almost anything. We think of putting Starbucks on credit cards or very inexpensive things. The 1920s, we're not there yet, but the idea is there are a growing number of items that people want and need to purchase, and they probably don't have enough cash on hand to buy them. We just talked about the automobile. That's probably the best example. Even today, a great majority of people purchasing an automobile take out a loan to do that. But also big ticket appliances and lots of other items around the home that you may not have enough cash on hand. I would imagine most people don't have $1,500, $1,800, or $2,000 to purchase a refrigerator today, and so they put that on credit, and people would do the same thing in the 1920s. And of course, a home is another item that most people purchase on credit. They take out a mortgage or take out a loan to purchase their home. And more banks, more and more industries and companies are willing to extend credit, partly because the economy is good and people are able to make their payments, and this allows companies to sell more items. Imagine how few automobiles would be purchased if people had to buy them with cash on hand. So credit is a very important aspect of the economy, and it keeps people purchasing things, and it keeps companies able to sell and produce their products. The stock market is both kind of a symptom of the prosperity of the 20s and also a contributing factor to the prosperity of the 20s. We'll talk much more about the stock market itself when we get to the infamous stock market crash of 1929. But certainly by the mid-1920s, more and more Americans were actively engaged in the stock market and owned stock. And as the prices of stocks grew, that meant that people had even more money in their pockets. And so the stock market is certainly part of this economic prosperity as well. We also think of the 1920s as an era in which new industries were becoming important in the economy. I mentioned the automobile. Obviously, that's one of the primary ones. But some of the older industries that we've talked about previously from the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s, beginning to recede somewhat and to be eclipsed by new industries on the rise. So industries like textiles, railroads, raw materials like coal and lumber, the meat packing industry, these we think about more in terms of the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s. By the 1920s, we are thinking about the automobile. We're thinking about processed foods. We're talking about ready-made clothing, entertainment like the movie industry, the radio, and appliances. And if you look at the picture on the right, you see a dozen or more kind of household gadgets and appliances. And these are the sorts of things that people are purchasing in large numbers during that time. So, the 1920s, a period of great economic prosperity. Is everyone enjoying the prosperity of the 1920s? No. In fact, it's worth mentioning that a large portion of the country making their living in agriculture, the farmers of the country, really don't participate in the prosperity of the 1920s. And part of the problem was that there was simply a glut of product being grown and produced on the farms throughout the 1920s, and so prices continued to fall. And again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the Great Depression. But most classes, most people did benefit from the economic prosperity of the 1920s. Certainly the wealthy benefited during this time. And it's an old cliche that it takes money to make money, but it certainly is true in the 1920s that those who had the means were able to capitalize greatly on the economic boom in the 1920s. And certainly when we think of something like the stock market, which most Americans can't afford to buy stocks, that's true today as it was in the 1920s. But those who have the money are the ones who are able to really enjoy this. So we do see most Americans enjoying some level of prosperity. It is the wealthy who really enjoy the boom of the 1920s. And by the end of the decade, we can look at a statistic like this, which indicates a great disparity of wealth, a pretty significant gap between the wealthy and the working class. And so take this statistic for what you will. The 36,000 wealthiest Americans had as much money or property as the 12 million poorest by the end of the 1920s. With the growth of business and industry in the 1920s, we also see a growth in advertising and publicity by those businesses. Advertising is becoming a major industry in its own right. It's not exactly a new industry. We've talked a little bit about advertising already in previous lectures, but it is becoming a much, much greater part of the economy. More and more businesses coming to realize that with effective advertising, they can multiply exponentially their ability to sell their products. And as you see the statistic here, by 1927, advertising was a $1.5 billion a year industry. Those who are working in advertising are developing new ways of thinking and new ways of advertising during this period. And one of the things that was very common within the advertisements of this era were that they appealed to very basic human desires. And perhaps even today, advertising appeals similarly. The desire to be loved, the desire to fit in, the desire to be rich, the desire to be successful. All of these sorts of things were very heavily emphasized in the advertising campaigns of the day. And in fact, advertising campaigns is something of a new development during this time. It's very common today if you watch the progressive commercials on television today. They all include the character Flo, and there's been a dozen or more of these commercials. The Geico Gecko, and these sorts of things that crop up, the Affleck duck. And so we come to identify with certain characters, certain themes. You expect a certain tone within these advertisements. That's a relatively new development in the 1920s, but you're starting to see companies developing characters to some extent, consistent themes, consistent ways of thinking across a variety of advertisements. And most of these advertising campaigns emphasize those human desires, and more particularly, the price that you would pay by not purchasing their products. Embarrassing discolorations in your clothing if you purchase the wrong detergent. Embarrassing smells that would result if you use the wrong soap or the wrong kinds of deodorant or something to that effect. And so again, if you want to fit in, if you want to be successful, you need to purchase these products because of the disastrous results if you don't. We're also seeing in the 1920s a development that's very common today, and that is celebrity endorsers advertising these products. And people wanted to wear the same kind of clothes that Babe Ruth was wearing or that Red Grange was wearing. They wanted to eat the same kinds of foods that some of the movie stars were eating. And so the celebrities of that era became important participants in many of the advertising campaigns. I think an element of that we need to address is just the idea of celebrity and fame itself. Yes, there had been famous, nationally known figures prior to this, But much earlier than the 1920s, if you're thinking about nationally known people, you're thinking presidents, you're thinking politicians, you're thinking perhaps military leaders and generals. The 1920s is really an era when we start to see radio stars, movie stars, professional athletes who were very, very well known. And so you have to have these celebrities if you're going to have celebrity endorsers. One famous example of these trends in advertising, and one of the great success stories in 1920s business, was that of Listerine, the mouthwash. Was Listerine the most effective mouthwash, the best mouthwash? We don't really know. That may be a matter of opinion as much as anything else. But their advertisements were hugely successful because they managed to convince much of the country that if they didn't use Listerine, that their lives would become a horrible mess for all kinds of different reasons. And you see the commercial or the advertisement on the screen, which is one example. How is your breath today? If it's bad, you won't be welcome. Okay, well, that's one result. Let me read you a few of the taglines from some of the other advertisements in the Listerine campaign. Often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. Edna's case really was a pathetic one. Why did she leave him that way? And simply, that's why you're a failure. And so you get the sense. If you don't use Listerine, your life is going to be a failure, your wife is going to leave you, and all of these sorts of things. Again, is any of that actually going to happen? We don't know. But they managed to get into people's minds, tap into those desires, and Listerine becomes one of the leading mouthwashes by the end of that decade. And again, we really have no idea if it's any better or worse than the others, but the advertising campaign was very effective. The prosperity of the 1920s fueled other industries as well. There was a proliferation of self-help books, books of etiquette and instruction manuals on how to get rich quick, beauty magazines and gossip magazines, and things of this nature. Calvin Coolidge famously suggested that the chief business of America is business. And so we see business itself becoming a business. Perhaps some of you are business majors or participants in the business school here at Lander University. That was a new development of the 1920s. Colleges creating business programs, business schools, and teaching classes on business. Service clubs like the Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, Lions Clubs soared in membership. Speakers begin making a living, traveling the country giving speeches about how to be successful. We also see a trend in literature and speeches of the era associating religion with business. It seems to legitimize or apologize for what otherwise might be seen as greedy or money-grubbing, but if it's biblically authorized, then it's okay. Many traveling salesmen of the day, for instance, quoted Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, "Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." The Metropolitan Casualty Insurance Company released a pamphlet titled "Moses, Persuader of Men," which said that Moses was one of the greatest salesmen and real estate promoters that ever lived. The most famous example of this trend was a best-selling book by the author Bruce Barton, which was called "The Man Nobody Knows." And you see the very sparse cover of that book in the picture. This was the best-selling nonfiction book in 1925 and 1926. In the book, Barton draws parallels between Christianity and business, between Jesus Christ and a businessman. At times in the book, Barton writes that Jesus was the most popular dinner guest in Jerusalem. He was an outdoor man. He was a great executive. Jesus, he wrote, picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. Nowhere is there such a startling example of executive success as the way in which that organization was brought together. And the parables, Bruce Barton wrote, were the most powerful advertisements of all time. He would be a national advertiser today. I suppose these ideas are correct, but it's an odd and interesting way to think about Jesus and Christianity and the Bible in terms of business. But it tells you a little bit about the way people in that era were thinking about business. And so it is into this atmosphere of economic prosperity that the nation begins lurching towards modernity, begins lurching towards a nation that you and I might recognize. Sometimes I'll make the comparison that if we could hop into a time machine and throw ourselves back to the Civil War era, the 1880s, 1890s, it would be very difficult for us to kind of identify with society. There wouldn't be a whole lot that we recognize as far as how we kind of survive and get along. By the end of the 1920s, I think it would be much easier for us to make that transition back in time. Certainly there are a lot of conveniences and a lot of technologies and inventions that we're accustomed to now. But if we went back to the 1920s, they have automobiles, they have radio, they have refrigerators, they have some of the appliances and conveniences that we are accustomed to. And so this really is a decade in which the nation begins approaching the kind of nation that you and I live in and would recognize. I think one of the noteworthy developments in that process is the development of the radio. Another of the critically important developments of this era. And it's really with the radio that for the first time the country has a medium, has a technology for all of us experiencing the same events at the same moment in time. This is a critically important leap forward in our society. Before the radio, the closest thing we had to this sort of mass media was what I described in a previous lecture as the penny press, yellow journalism, newspapers or magazines that millions of people are reading. Okay, so we're reading the same stories, we're kind of experiencing the same viewpoint from the editors. But we're not seeing those things play out in the same instant. Or in the case of radio, we're not hearing those things play out in the same instant. You think about some of the cataclysmic and important events of recent history, something like 9/11, something like the assassination of JFK, the entire nation transfixed live as these events are happening. Prior to the radio, you really don't have any way to do that. And so it was a hugely important development. And radio came onto the scene very quickly, becoming a household item. The first significant radio broadcast was on November 2nd, 1920, so here we are at the beginning of the decade, carrying the returns of the 1920 presidential election. We don't know for sure, but can only estimate that there may have only been a few hundred people listening to that broadcast. At that early time, radio was a hobby. You have probably seen pictures of the early radio enthusiasts. These items were incredibly cumbersome. You had to hold up these huge, awkward antennae to try to tune into whatever smattering of things might be being broadcast at any one time. But people recognized very quickly the importance of a medium like radio, and its rise to prominence is startlingly fast. We have only to look at another example. 6 or 7 months later, a boxing match featuring Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight champion, against the French champion Georges Carpentier. This is known among sports enthusiasts as the first $1 million match. The gate drew $1 million in ticket sales. But for our purpose, it's equally important to note that this boxing match was carried on more than 80 stations around the country, and tens of thousands of listeners tuned in on the radio. So we're just a few months after that early broadcast of the presidential returns, and already tens of thousands of people listening. Within just another year or two, hundreds of stations are broadcasting information around the clock. Early programming was dominated by educational programs. Christian programming was very prominent, followed soon enough by some of the other things we're familiar with today. Music programs, in some ways talk shows, those would be coming on. Sporting events, but also what were called serials, which are basically like our soap operas or television shows that move forward each day a little bit more in the plot, but you can tune in a month later and you still haven't missed that much. So these were daily programs at the same time, moving the story forward a little bit with each passing day. I mentioned sports. Big-time sports and radio in some ways are raised hand in hand during this period. Sports, as it turned out, was a perfect thing to be broadcast over the radio. And with talented announcers on the radio, a sporting event could become a really gripping event. And thousands of people, again, would tune in at the same time and listen to these broadcasts. I'll be talking a little bit later about some of the prominent sports figures, but huge famous sports figures like Jack Dempsey, Babe Ruth, Bill Tilden, who was the tennis champion, the racehorse Man of War, many other figures kind of gripped our attention as we listened on the radio. One other industry that I want to mention rising to prominence during this time was the beauty industry. And again, this speaks to some extent to the changing morals, certainly the changing ideas of femininity and women, which we'll be talking about at some length a little bit later. But we see this represented in the rise of beauty as an industry. The first recorded beauty contest in the country was in July of 1921 in Washington, D.C. Contestants wearing full-length body bathing suits, hats, stockings, corsets, and all of these other things. Just a couple of months later, in September, in Atlantic City, we might call the first modern beauty pageant was held. Now the contestants wearing skin-tight one-piece bathing suits, revealing much more leg or skin at that time. And so we see very rapidly at the beginning of the decade these changes in the expectations of women.